All right, boys, let's get right into it. This is the resilient upper body. Now, in this video, I'm going to break down my full training philosophy on building the most complete upper body, right? Not just in terms of gaining muscle, but everything, right? Hypertrophy, strength, durability, functionality, right? This isn't just going to be your typical bro split video. This is going to be an approach that takes inspiration from many different training modalities. And I'm just going to try to do my best on encapsulating the what, the how, the why, on maximizing the capabilities of your upper body. So let's get it. So if you guys been following me for a while, you guys know I've always prioritized lower body in my training. I'm an individual where, I always prioritize the lower body. And I honestly think most people should take that approach as well, because that's where true athleticism, functionality, power, and strength derive from. But over the past 3 months, I've been recovering from a knee surgery, so I couldn't even work out that much. And if I was working out, I was training upper body. So basically, all that's been on my mind in terms of training for the last 3 months, just like, how can I maximize upper body development? How can I maximize upper body training? And it just made me realize how important the upper body is as well, right? Legs, no doubt, they are very important. Legs are the power and the drive, but the upper body is going to give you that frame, that size, and that durability. And both aspects are very important. And the way I like to think about it is like, imagine your body is like a missile launch system, right? And you're trying to strike somebody with a missile, right? You can have a very powerful launch system, the thing that actually launches the missile in the air. That's the equivalent to having strong legs, strong and explosive legs, right? You can have athleticism in the legs, and that's comparable to you having a very strong launch system that can, shoot that missile very far. But it's no good if if the missile is small. And that's what upper body is. Upper body is like the size of the missile itself, right? So the lower body offers that power and that drive, but to truly give impact and be able to receive impact, you need to have a strong upper body, right? And I think a major trap that a lot of individuals fall into, when they kind of train more of that like functional wave or more of that athletic wave. Like, I know a lot of guys that are specialized in athletic training, functional training, and they do all these plyometrics, they do all these lower body exercises, and they might have a strong, very powerful lower body, but to me, it doesn't really matter if you don't have the upper body density as well. That's like power that doesn't really have an impact. So it's very important that you have a resilient, jacked, durable upper body, even if your goal isn't to be a bodybuilder, right? And again, that's the trap a lot of these functional guys fall into, is because they think they're being athletic, being functional, and they mistake actually building density in the upper body as some bodybuilder training, and that just causes them to be flimsy and in turn take away from their athleticism, because right, durability is a part of athleticism. So right, the upper body must be resilient, and it also must function well as well, right? You don't want to build a bunch of mass but then sacrifice from mobility and efficiency and just function. So there is a way to do both. It must also have strong frame and size so that you can actually, in contact situations, you can actually receive and give impact. It also must be balanced and have no weak links, right? You don't want to have overdevelopment in certain areas and underdevelopment in certain areas that can increase the chance of injury and take away from your longevity. And lastly, it must also be coordinated, right? You need to be able to coordinate the lower body to the upper body for these dynamic actions and just being efficient with force transfer throughout the body. So how do we do all this that we just talked about? First, you have to build up all of the individual parts of the upper body. All parts must be built up, right? This isn't going to be some approach where, you want to prioritize this muscle because it's going to give you that illusion. No, you must be training everything. You must be very well-rounded, right? The major musculature must be strong and resilient, but then all the smaller musculature must be developed as well and perform its role in supporting the larger muscles. Another thing is the strength ratios between opposing muscles must be balanced. So you don't want to be that guy that's, benching all this weight, but then, have weak pulling muscles, right? That's just a recipe for poor posture, right? Injury risk, right? You want to be well balanced everywhere. And lastly, the connective tissues must also be developed to promote athleticism and long-term durability. So what is the method of training that's going to allow for this complete upper body development. I'm going to break everything down here for you, okay? So this isn't going to be your bodybuilding approach where you just simply isolate each muscle group, right? This is going to be for the individual who wants size, but at the same time wants function, durability, balance, not just growth in, specific body parts, right? If your goal is to build a resilient upper body that performs, your training has to be rooted in function, not vanity. And this is how I view training. Like, you always want to prioritize training the body to work how it was designed over just growing. Okay, so I'm gonna break it down here for you. For the sake of this video, I'm gonna divide the upper body into 4 main systems that you need to build. Okay, each of these systems has to be equally developed to ensure the body is balanced and have no gaps. In each of these 4 systems, I'm going to outline the most important functions and the musculature that is worked during these functions and the best exercises to train them. Okay, so the 4 main systems, the first is going to be the anterior system, which is the motor, right? Posterior system, which is the frame, the extremities, which is the workhorse of the upper body, and the core, which is the connection of the upper body. So I'm going to break everything down here for you. So first, the anterior system. The reason why I call this the motor of the upper body is because these muscles are responsible for applying massive amounts of force for all of your pushing movements. And that is one of our strongest capabilities as humans, okay? These muscles are primarily responsible for pushing, framing, applying force, and stabilizing positions in front of you. So the major muscles include the pec major and the anterior delts. And the supporting muscles include pec minor, serratus anterior, and subscapularis, which is a part of your rotator cuff that assists with pushing type movements. So how do we develop the anterior system? I'm first going to start with the major muscles of the pecs and the shoulder. Now, both of these muscle groups can be trained with the press. The press is a versatile pattern that can be performed at many different angles with many different types of equipment. Now, vertical presses are mainly going to target the shoulders. 3 of my favorite vertical pressing variations are the standard overhead press, or the seated overhead press, or something like a Z press, basically a press with no back support. Okay? Your horizontal / downward presses are going to target more of the pecs and going to have varying degrees of shoulder activation depending on the angle, right? So something like a bench press, fantastic exercise for developing the pecs, right? Something like an incline bench press, which due to the angle is going to have a little bit more shoulder activation. And a downward press like the dip is going to be another great chest builder. Now, these are all very generic movement patterns, but where some variability can come into play is using different types of equipment to do these movements. Okay, not just for these listed on here, but for literally every exercise that I'm about to cover in this presentation. One thing that I would encourage is do it with different equipment, right? You can go barbell overhead press. You could do it with dumbbells. You could do it single-sided. You can do a bench press. You can go on the floor and do a floor press. You can do a dumbbell bench press. You can do dips. You can do it on rings, right? There's so many different ways to variate the movement, and you gain something unique out of each variation. So I really encourage that within myself and a lot of my clients. Now, as far as range of motion on all these, for balance gains in hypertrophy, strength, durability, and mobility, as a general rule, I would go to the fullest range of motion that you can while still being comfortable and still being able to push that intensity. Now, pressing is the main movement responsible for developing those shoulders and pecs, and honestly, you'd be just fine, well off if you were to just press, right? But there are some secondary movements that you should fit into your training as well. The first is going to be your fly motion, horizontal adduction, basically your chest fly variations. These include things like the pec deck or, pressing at a wide angle where you really get that length in your chest. The second is going to be your lateral / frontal raise movement pattern, shoulder abduction. This is really going to include any type of lateral raise variations where you take your arms away from your body. Now, these secondary movements are best done at a lower intensity and higher rep ranges to add a little bit more volume and fill out the rest of your anterior system and also diversify the movement a little bit. But it doesn't stop there. We must train our supporting musculature as well. These include things like the pec minor, the subscapularis, the serratus anterior. And honestly, this video is not like an anatomy lesson, so I don't want to get too much into the specifics. I want to give you guys, practical things that you can take away. Basically, all of these supporting musculature will allow you to press stably, be efficient, and do these things with longevity. So how you build up, these supporting muscles, honestly, a lot of it's going to be covered with your free weight training, right? When you're doing free weight training, pushing yourself, and you're doing things the correct way with correct form, you're going to be using a lot of these stability muscles, and they are going to get some work. But, what I find is doing special exercises or drills to specifically focus on the supporting musculature, it makes me feel good and also just helps me progress. Okay, so the two types of movements to really train the supporting musculature in that anterior system, the first is going to be anything with shoulder protraction or stability in that position. So a really good example of this is something like the push-up plus. And the reason why they call it a push-up plus is because you do a push-up and then you push out a little bit more. Okay, shoulder protraction is basically when you push and you push so much that your upper back even starts to round. So anything where you're training in that position, anything where you're training the stability of that position, the strength of that, max out push position is going to be great. Anything that involves lockout holds, right? You can lock out the end position of a dip or a dumbbell bench press, right? Anything where you're locking out a position with your arm out in front of you pushing and you're really working that stability, that's going to be great for shoulder protraction. A lot of body weight movements are really good for this as well, right? Like a lot of these animal flow type movements, bear crawls, quadruped position. A lot of calisthenics is great for, building that shoulder protraction and building the supporting musculature in the anterior system, right? You guys know that serratus anterior, that's one of the muscles listed above. That's what they call the boxer's muscle, right? Because it's so pronounced in boxers because they're always reaching out in front of them. But if you look at a lot of calisthenics athletes from all these advanced, positions that they hold, the planche, right, the handstands, their serratus anterior is very well developed as well. Another type of movement that's really going to strengthen the supporting musculature is anything with upward scapular movement or, working stability in that position. So one of my favorite movements for this, for beginners especially, is something like the kettlebell windmill. That's basically when you hinge and at the same time you're stabilizing a kettlebell overhead. And that offset nature of the kettlebell is really going to work the serratus anterior and really going to work the stabilizing function, really strengthen all those supporting muscles, right? Anything where you're, doing a bottoms up press, when people flip that kettlebell upside down and they do presses, that really works the stabilizing aspect. Landmine presses are also a really good way. I find that angle of pressing really activates the serratus. Also, with single arm variations, you really get to work that stability. Another very underrated way to work that upward scapular stability is going to be snatches, right? Dumbbell snatches, kettlebell snatches, barbell snatches. You just having to catch that weight dynamically overhead is really going to build up the supporting musculature. Okay, so now let's take it to the posterior system, and this is probably the most underrated part of upper body training. I call this the frame of the upper body because that whole backside of your torso is really what gives you that size, gives you that presence. And not only that, these muscles are going to be responsible for pulling, holding certain positions, right? Holding immovable structure, right? And also a lot to do with durability and capability, right? A lot of those pressing movements I discussed earlier can only be done safely and for a long period of time if your back and your posterior system is developed. So the major muscles in this posterior system are going to be your lats, your posterior delts, and your traps, okay? The supporting muscles are going to be your rhomboids and your rotator cuff. So how do we work the posterior system? Now, all of the muscles in the back can be trained with the pull, right? Just like the press, this is a very generic movement pattern. And the activation of each type of back musculature is going to vary with the type of pulling variation and the angle of pull. So let's first start with vertical pulling. So anytime you have to pull something vertically, you have to point your chest up and roll your shoulders down. This is going to encourage downward rotation of that scapula. And in this position, you're really prioritizing those lats and lower traps. So two great movements for this are your pull-up variations. So things like pull-ups, chin-ups, neutral grip pull-ups, ring pull-ups. Again, I want you guys to do these variations so you can diversify your movement profile. These are great for prioritizing those lats and lower traps. Another movement pattern is going to be your pull down variation. So instead of pulling your body weight up, right, doing things like lat pull downs, again, with different grips, supinated, pronated, mag grip, right? And there's a lot of machine, plate loaded pull downs that you can do as well. Now, horizontal pulling is similar, but has some key differences, right? Horizontal pulling is anytime you're pulling something to your chest. Now, in this position, instead of downwardly rotating your scapula, this is going to promote scapular retraction, right? Rolling your shoulders back. And in this position, you're going to be using your rhomboids and middle traps to stabilize that pulling action. So you're going to get a little bit more stability work within the rhomboids and middle traps. And in turn, this horizontal pulling position is going to involve more of your upper back, and it's going to involve more of those posterior delts, as well as getting some lats in there. So it's very important to do both of these types of pulling. A lot of people specialize in one, but you really want to do both, right? So some horizontal pulling examples are things like barbell or dumbbell rows. Obviously, like I said, there's many different variations. Your chest supported rows, right? Something like a chest supported T-bar row or a seal row. Another thing that you can pay attention to is modifying the angle of your elbow, right? Flared out elbows, you're going to prioritize more of that upper back. If you're kind of rowing back more towards your ribs, you're more prioritizing that lower back. Now, besides just pulling, there are 3 additional posterior system movements that I believe are mandatory. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of people that just do pull-ups and, rows, and I'm sure they have a, good physique, but this is for the individual that wants to cover all bases and leave no weak links in the upper body. You must include these 3. So the first is going to be your rear delt fly motion. So shoulder abduction, right? Think about your dumbbell rear delt raises, your machine rear delt flies, right? Your band pull aparts. Anything in that nature where you're driving your arms behind your body. Second is the shrug motion. Now, the shrug motion is really great for using the traps to move something violently and heavy, right? And also, it's great for, strengthening the neck as well. So things like dumbbell shrugs, barbell shrugs. I love the upright rows. And, if you are someone that does Olympic lifting variations like high pulls, cleans, things like that, you're going to get a lot of work in those traps. And lastly, the pull over motion. Now, think about your cable lat pullovers or your dumbbell pullovers. This type of movement is very slept on, but, it's going to train your lats in that fullest range of motion. And, it also opens up that thoracic spine. All in all, it's a very beneficial movement to keep in your program. And lastly, you need to strengthen your rotator cuff musculature for durability in both pulling and pressing so you can do this for a long period of time. And the way you're going to do this is by building up shoulder external rotation. So there's a lot of different ways to train this, but the concept is the same. You want to train that capability of the shoulder to externally rotate with load. So some of my favorite ways to train this are, body weight methods. So I like to do 90-90 pulls, as I call it, with, TRX or rings, or you can go cable or dumbbell external rotations. One of my favorite ways to work cable external rotations is actually on the seated cable row. I find it's the easiest to get into. It's the easiest for me to identify mind to muscle. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, but you want to be sure that you're training shoulder external rotation. Now let's take it to the third system. This is the extremities, or basically just your arms, okay? And I call these the workhorse of the upper body. And the reason why I call these the workhorse is because the arms, right? You can have a lot of strength, a lot of power within your legs and your torso, but your arms are usually the thing that applies force, right? These are the things that actually express your raw strength and athleticism. These are the first things to make contact. These are the first things to receive contact. So your arms are actually, used a lot, not really in like generating force by themselves, but in just receiving force, right? And what I find is the arms are often neglected by athletes because, they think it doesn't really, it's not really useful. And they're correct. Arms don't really generate power. The arms aren't really going to do a lot by themselves, but they cap power, right? If your arms are flimsy and weak, you're not going to be able to generate a lot of power through the limbs. They also direct power and they apply it, right? They are the first point of contact for everything. And if this link in the chain breaks, everything fails. So the arms are very important, even for people that aren't just bodybuilders. The major muscles in this system is going to be your biceps and your triceps, obviously, right? The supporting muscles, there's a lot of little small muscles in the arms, but just for the sake of the video, the things that we're going to cover are your wrist extensors, right? Anything that drives your knuckles up, right? The brachioradialis, which is the forearm muscles, and your grip. Now, the bulk of training your arms is going to come from elbow extension and flexion. So basically extending and curling, right? So biceps and tricep training. Now, this is going to cover all the major muscles of the arms, but it's also going to cover a lot of the supporting musculature as well. Now, with both bicep and tricep training, it's very important that you do both short range of movement motions and long range of movement motions. What I mean by this, you want to do movements that prioritize the short range, exercises in which the layout and the leverage of the exercise in general prioritizes more tension in that more contracted position, right? But you also want to do exercises that prioritize more of that stretched position. And the shorter range of motion movements are really going to strengthen, positional strength and going to give you that tightness, while, long range motions of training for the arms is going to give you more of that durability, right? It's going to train your muscles and your joints to operate in more compromised positions. So, for example, the biceps, this is going to be trained with elbow flexion. Now, our short range of movement motions are things like the easy bar curl, dumbbell curl, a lot of, bodybuilding curl machines, they kind of prioritize more of that contraction, more of that peak. But at the same time, you want to do long range of movement motions as well. Two of my favorites are the dumbbell incline curl, where you lean back, you let that bicep undergo a full stretch, and you know what's a long range motion when you're like you go too heavy, you can literally tear your bicep, right? Something like the preacher curl, where you having that back pad at the back of your tricep, and you're kind of using that as leverage to emphasize more of that stretch position. You want to do both of these in your training. For the triceps, right? Elbow extensions. The short range of movements are things like, rope pull downs, where you're very just focused on, contracting that tricep, or something like a tricep press down, right? More of the long range would be something where, you're doing it overhead, you're biasing that stretch position, something like a triceps overhead extension or a skull crusher. Now, there are many intermediary muscles in the arms, but most are going to be hit during your regular bicep and triceps training. Now, one area I would intentionally train is the brachioradialis and the forearm musculature. And the best ways to do this are, number one, is the most basic way, is a hammer curl, right? That neutral grip when you're holding that dumbbell is going to shift more load to that brachioradialis. Another good example is something like a Zottman curl, which is basically where you curl the weight up, you turn the wrist out, and you lower in that reverse curl position. In addition to this, anything, reverse curl is really going to work that brachioradialis and that forearm, right? Grip work. This is another good way to strengthen this region of the body. And with grip work, there's so many different variations, but anything that challenges your grip. Now, another aspect of training the extremities is impact loading. And I feel like this is so slept on for training the arms, right? Think about it. The arms are the first point of contact for everything, right? So it's not just about being strong. It's about being resilient and durable enough to withstand forces generated by your trunk and others by external impact. You want to train the arms to accept force abruptly, just like we do plyometrics for the lower body to bulletproof our knees and our ankles. You want to train the upper body as well to accept all this dynamic energy and in turn increase durability and further strengthen the wrists and the elbows. So examples include anything where you have to land on the wrist, something like a plyometric push-up where you have to load up, you come off the ground and you're landing, you're receiving all that impact. That's going to really load that tricep and wrist extension function very abruptly. And on the other side of the coin, any type of dynamic pulling movement, things that load the bicep and the muscles involved in wrist flexion very quickly. Something like an explosive row, something like explosive pull-ups where you have to catch the bar every time. These are very good examples for this. Now, the last system of the body is going to be the core. Now, this is the connection of the upper body. This is where everything comes together. This stabilizes, transfers, holds together. This is the key for, taking all the gains you make in your lower body and your upper body and actually applying them in sport, in real life, right? The major muscles in this system are going to be your rectus abdominis, your internal and external obliques, and your supporting muscles are going to be your transversus abdominis, which is basically your deep core muscle behind all of this, your QL, which is on the back, lower back, and then your erectors of the spine. Now, as far as training the core, I believe that stabilization is first. This is the most fundamental skill. This is what I teach all my beginner clients when I first start working them, is just simply how to stabilize, how to engage your core. Now, when you learn to stabilize, you're gonna engage that transversus abdominis, your deep core muscle, because that is the muscle that is involved in stabilization. Now, the best way to work stabilization is probably going to be your heavy torso loaded compound movements, a lot of unilateral movements where, something like a Bulgarian split squat where you have to balance to one side. This is really going to train that stability of the core, especially if you're doing it with free weights. And then lastly, another good way is any type of carry, right? Two-handed carries, offset carries where you're carrying something in one hand. These type of movements are really going to teach you how to stabilize using the core. And what I find is these movements also just fill in the gaps of your torso as a whole, right? There's a big difference between someone that just sits on machines and someone that is very competent in free weights and balance. And usually you can tell that in both capability and aesthetics, just the way that the torso fills out. Now, after stabilization, there's 4 fundamental movements that the core must be able to do, and you must train the core in these 4 ways. A lot of people just do 2. Okay, so the first is going to be flexion. Now, this is very simple. This is anytime you flex your spine forward. This is what most people do, right? Sit-ups. These are things like leg raises, cable crunches, anything where you have to bend forward. This is going to really recruit the rectus abdominis, that six-pack, and this is probably the best movement for just building muscle on the abdominals. The next movement pattern is extension. So this is flexion is you sitting forward. Extension is the other way around. It's you extending, right? Extending, using that lower back. Now with this movement, there's pretty much 2 variations here. You can either go back extension where you lock down your legs and you move your head, or you can go reverse hyperextension. Not a lot of gyms have it, but this is a machine that basically locks down your upper body and moves your feet up, right? Both of these variations are great, but you want to be working that extension for the lower back and the erectors. Now, next is lateral flexion and extension. Just like you flex and extend, in this plane forward, you want to do the same side to side. And I find that this alleviates a lot of back pain. This is very therapeutic. It also kind of just opens up your movement profile. Some of my favorite exercises for this are side bends. You could do it with cables. You could do it with dumbbells. And there's a lot of body weight variations that you can do to where you can practice that lateral flexion and extension motion. And lastly, probably the most fundamental skill out of this whole page is rotation. Now, not many people train rotation. It's probably the most important pattern because the core is what integrates the lower body and upper body together. And a lot of people just, try to isolate the core, isolate the lower body, isolate the upper body, but they never truly gain true functionality in sport and in real life because they don't know how to integrate everything. And rotation is what kind of gives you your body and teaches it how to integrate the actions of the lower body to the upper body. So at its most basic level, this includes things like wood choppers. Anytime you have to rotate with a cable. Something like a medicine ball throw. Landmines are a very good tool for training rotation. There's a lot of different ways that you can train rotation on a landmine. And lastly, this could be as simple as just adding rotational elements to other foundational movements, right? A lot of times rotation can coexist with other movement patterns such as lunging, such as pulling, such as pushing. You can really implement rotation into any type of movement, and doing so is going to get some more core activation and teach your body just how to move. Now, I know that was a lot of information. There's a lot of different muscle groups to train, a lot of different functions that you have to train for. This is kind of how I put it all together so that I can fit it all into 1 week of training. So right now I'm doing an upper, lower, upper, lower, upper split. And I do 3 days training upper. During my lower days, I'm working most of my physical therapy and my rehab stuff. But in my upper days, I really try to push it. So this is how I put it all together. On my first upper body day, it's a horizontal push and horizontal pull. So I pair both of them together. I go into some, a heavy chest movement, a heavy pulling movement, and then I add my chest fly in there to diversify the movement. I go pullovers, I work my triceps, and then I work my core. On the second upper day, it's a vertical pressing, vertical pulling day, right? So I'm doing some type of shoulder movement, some type of pull up, some type of pull down, and then I go into my biceps. And then I train my rotator cuffs, I add the shrug movement, and then a lateral raise type movement. On my last upper day, now this is kind of a more full upper body day where I literally train everything. I mainly focus on core because I don't train that too much in the past 2 upper days. I train my triceps and my biceps again. I train my extensors, my grips, some type of stability work. I get some rear delt in there. And then I just dedicate the rest of the session on, more volume on pressing and pulling, probably some different variations of what I did in the past 2 upper days. So if you stayed to the end of this video, hey, I really appreciate it, bro. Like, these videos take so long to make, and they're very frustrating to make. This is probably like my 10th take, and just like, requires so much focus, so much time. So I really appreciate it. If you guys enjoy the content, go ahead and subscribe. If you want to implement this type of philosophy in your training to build a complete upper body, right? Not just building muscle, but for all aspects, durability, strength, longevity, function, go ahead and book a call in the description, and we can come up with a game plan on how we can implement this system to your specific life. Otherwise, I'm going to see you guys in the next one. Peace.